There's a photograph that sits in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. It shows a German-made machine about the size of a large desk covered in switches and dials. On its surface, punch cards feed through mechanical readers with methodical precision. This machine, manufactured by a subsidiary of International Business Machines, wasn't designed to kill anyone. It was designed to count them, to categorize them, to track them from identification to deportation to extermination. And the parent company in New York knew exactly what it was being used for. During World War II, we were taught a simple story. The forces of good fought the forces of evil. The Allies battled the Axis. Democracy confronted fascism. But hidden beneath this black and white narrative was a shadow economy painted in shades of gray, where American corporations, European industrialists, and neutral nation intermediaries created a secret marketplace that operated regardless of which side was winning. These weren't rogue operators or black market criminals. These were some of the world's most respected companies, conducting business with both Allied and Axis powers simultaneously, often with the full knowledge of their home governments. This is the story of the firms that made fortunes by selling to everyone. The corporations that built the machinery of genocide while simultaneously supplying the forces fighting against it. The executives who shook hands with Hitler on Tuesday and dined with Allied officials on Thursday. The bankers who laundered Nazi gold while financing American war bonds. These were the Black Market Czars, and their profits were measured in billions while the death toll climbed into the millions. The architect of extermination, IBM's Holocaust partnership on January 30, 1933, the day Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Few American businessmen could have predicted what role they would play in the regime that would follow. But for International Business Machines and its charismatic president, Thomas Watson Sr., the rise of the Third Reich represented something else entirely, an unprecedented business opportunity. Within months, Watson had arranged meetings with Nazi officials. By August of that year, he was sitting across from Adolf Hitler himself, discussing how IBM's revolutionary technology could transform Germany. What was this technology? The Hollerith machine, named after its German-American inventor Hermann Hollerith, was the cutting edge of data processing in the 1930s. These machines used punch cards, about the size of a dollar bill, with holes punched in specific patterns to store information. Feed these cards through an IBM reader, and you could do something that had never been possible before. You could not only count people, but derive information about them. You could count how many were in a room, then instantly know how many were men, how many were women, how many were Jewish, how many were Christian, how many had blonde hair, how many had dark eyes, how many were tailors, how many were bankers, where they were born, where they lived. Every characteristic could be coded, stored, and retrieved at mechanical speed. For the Nazi regime, obsessed with racial categorization and the systematic identification of undesirables, this technology was transformative. In 1933, Germany conducted a comprehensive census using IBM machines provided through the company's German subsidiary, Deutsche Hollerith Maschinengesellschaft, known as DEHOMAG. This wasn't a standard census asking about occupation and family size. This was a racial census, the first of its kind, designed specifically to identify Jews by blood rather than just by religious affiliation. The punch cards were custom designed by IBM engineers to Nazi specifications, with special columns dedicated to categorizing citizens by race. But the 1933 census was only the beginning. As the Nazi regime tightened its grip on power and expanded its persecution, IBM's involvement deepened. The company didn't simply sell machines and walk away. The Hollerith system required constant maintenance, regular servicing, and an unending supply of custom punch cards. Each card could only be used once. Without a continuing supply from IBM, the machines would have been as useful as rifles without bullets. And IBM, through DEHOMAG and later through its Swiss office to maintain plausible deniability, made sure that supply never stopped. IBM's technology became embedded in virtually every phase of the Holocaust. In the identification phase, census machines sorted millions of citizens, creating comprehensive lists of Jews and other targeted groups. Local officials who had once required weeks to compile such lists could now generate them in days. When grim-faced SS officers burst into town squares posting notices demanding that certain citizens report for deportation the next morning, those notices were generated from IBM databases. The question that had haunted historians for decades, how did the Nazis always have the lists, finally had an answer. In the exclusion phase, as Jews were systematically stripped of their rights, property, and businesses, IBM machines tracked the confiscation process. Every seized asset, every restricted business, every prohibited profession was recorded on punch cards. In the Gittization phase, as Jewish populations were forced into crowded quarters in cities across occupied Europe, Hollerith departments managed the logistics. Who was assigned to which ghetto, when they were transferred, what rations they received. Everything was tracked with mechanical precision. Then came deportation. The rail systems that transported millions to the concentration camps operated with clock-like efficiency, and that efficiency was enabled by IBM technology. Railway offices across Nazi-controlled Europe were equipped with Hollerith machines that scheduled trains, tracked cargo, and optimized routes. The difference was that the cargo was human beings. In 1942, as the Holocaust reached its peak, trains departing for Auschwitz, Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen, and other death camps ran like a well-oiled machine. Their schedules maintained by IBM punch card systems that ensured the camps could process arrivals without bottlenecks. Inside the concentration camps themselves, almost every major facility had a Hollerith department. At Auschwitz, at Dachau, at Mauthausen, prisoners were assigned 5-digit identification numbers that corresponded to their punch cards. These cards tracked prisoner skills, work assignments, and eventual fate. When prisoners arrived, their information was punched into cards. When they were assigned to forced labor, building weapons for the Nazi war machine, their cards were updated. When they were worked to death or sent to the gas chambers, the final status was recorded. The code for a Jewish prisoner was 6. The code for death in the gas chamber was 8. IBM's technology had become the administrative backbone of genocide. The evidence of IBM's involvement is overwhelming and meticulously documented. Historian Edwin Black spent years researching the company's role, eventually publishing his findings in 2001. His investigation revealed that IBM's relationship with Nazi Germany was no accident of history or rogue operation by a German subsidiary. It was actively managed from IBM's headquarters on Madison Avenue in New York throughout the 12-year Reich. Thomas Watson personally micromanaged the relationship, even receiving a medal from Hitler in 1937. Though he eventually returned it in 1940 under public pressure. Even more damning, IBM continued its involvement after the United States entered the war in December 1941. While direct contact became illegal, the company routed communications and transactions through its offices in neutral Switzerland. The machines in Nazi Europe continued to be serviced twice monthly, whether they were located in downtown Berlin or at Auschwitz. Custom punch cards, produced at the rate of 1.5 billion per year in Germany alone, continued to flow. Insurance companies, both American and German, maintained coverage on the machines at their known locations. The business relationship continued, carefully hidden behind corporate structures and neutral intermediaries, but never truly severed. After the war, IBM not only escaped prosecution, but thrived. The company never faced charges for its role in enabling the Holocaust. Watson stepped down in 1949 and was celebrated as one of America's greatest businessmen. And in one final bitter irony, when American forces bombed some of IBM's facilities in Nazi Germany during the war, the company later sued for reparations and won, receiving compensation for damages to the very machines that had been used to process concentration camp inmates. The telephone conspiracy, ITT's dual game. If IBM provided the information infrastructure for the Nazi regime, International Telephone and Telegraph provided the communications backbone. But IT's wartime activities went far beyond telecommunications. Under the leadership of Colonel Sosthenes Ben, a charismatic businessman who had served in World War I, ITT became one of the most brazenly opportunistic corporations of the war, actively profiting from both sides while playing them against each other. But Bain had founded ITT in 1920 with a vision of creating a global telecommunications empire. By the early 1930s, he had acquired telephone companies and manufacturing subsidiaries across Europe, including Standard Elektrizitätsgesellschaft and Lawrence in Germany. These weren't small operations. They were major industrial concerns employing tens of thousands of workers. And as Hitler rose to power, Bain saw opportunity rather than threat. On August 3, 1933, just 7 months after Hitler became chancellor, Bain secured a private audience with the Führer. It was one of Hitler's first meetings with an American businessman, a deliberate signal that he valued IT's cooperation. Bain came with his German representative, Henry Mann, and the two men discussed how ITT could expand its operations under the new regime. Hitler was receptive. He understood that Germany's military ambitions would require modern communications infrastructure, and ITT had the technology and expertise he needed. To cement the relationship, Bain made strategic moves that would ensure ITT's German operations remained protected, even if war came. He appointed German nationals to key positions in his subsidiaries, carefully selecting men who were acceptable to the Nazi Party. One of these men was Kurt von Schrader, a banker who would later become a general in the SS, and a crucial financial conduit to Heinrich Himmler's Gestapo. Another was Gerhard Westrick, a lawyer whose firm represented several American companies in Germany. Westrick would become ITT's de facto representative within the Nazi power structure. Through these connections, ITT's German subsidiary Lorenz acquired a 25% stake in Focke-Wulf, an aircraft manufacturer. This wasn't a passive investment. Focke-Wulf produced some of the Luftwaffe's most successful fighter planes, the very aircraft that would soon be bombing Allied ships in cities. The FW-190 fighter, introduced in 1941, was superior to the British Spitfire in many respects when it first entered service. Every one that rolled off the assembly line contained components manufactured or financed through ITT's investment. The company was literally profiting from weapons that were killing Allied soldiers. But here's where ITT's duplicity becomes truly staggering. While the company's German subsidiaries were building fighters for the Luftwaffe, ITT's laboratories in New Jersey were developing defensive technology for the Allies. In 1942, ITT engineers invented a high-frequency direction finder designed specifically to protect Allied convoys from German submarine attacks. The very same corporation was simultaneously providing the weapons system that endangered Allied ships and the defensive system that protected them. ITT was playing both sides of the board, collecting checks from Berlin and Washington alike. The company's wartime activities extended far beyond manufacturing. ITT owned communications networks throughout Latin America, and there is substantial evidence suggesting these lines may have been used to transmit intelligence to German submarines operating in the Atlantic. While this has never been definitively proven, Bain's known sympathies toward Hitler and the strategic value of South American cables make it highly plausible. What is certain is that ITT used its neutral Spanish facilities to maintain contact with both Allied and Axis powers throughout the war, serving as a communications bridge that should not have existed. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, a normal company would have severed all ties with enemy nations. ITT did not. In March 1942, in the middle of the war, Gerhard Westrick climbed aboard an ITT-manufactured Focke-Wulf bomber and flew from Germany to Madrid, where he met with Sosthenes Bain, who had flown in from New York. The purpose? To discuss how ITT could maintain its German operations and ensure profits would be protected. They met again in Bern, Switzerland, discussing ways to improve Hitler's communication systems, the same systems that were coordinating the Wehrmacht's operations across Europe. The Roosevelt administration knew about these meetings. Documents reveal that State Department and Treasury officials were aware that ITT was maintaining contact with the enemy. Yet no action was taken. Why? Because ITT's domestic operations were considered too valuable to disrupt. The company was also providing communications equipment to the U.S. military. Shutting them down would have created immediate supply problems. So the government made a calculated decision: allow ITT to continue its double game, monitor their activities, but take no decisive action. After the war, the true scale of ITT's collaboration became clear. The company had not only maintained its German investments but had grown them. By 1943, ITT had become the largest shareholder in Focke-Wulf with a 29% stake. In one of the war's great ironies, when Allied bombers struck Focke-Wulf facilities, destroying the factories that had built fighters to shoot down those very bombers, ITT filed for war damages. In 1967, the company received $27 million in compensation from the American government for Allied bombing of German factories that ITT had used to build weapons for Nazi Germany. They were literally paid reparations for having their Nazi assets destroyed by American bombs. ITT's executives faced no criminal charges. Sosthenes Bain continued as the company's leader until 1956, celebrated for building an international business empire. Kurt von Schrader, the Nazi SS general who had sat on ITT's German boards, was interrogated after the war but faced minimal consequences relative to his involvement in financing the Gestapo. The corporation he had worked for remained one of America's most powerful conglomerates. While IBM provided the bureaucratic infrastructure for genocide and ITT provided communications and weapons, Standard Oil of New Jersey made the entire Nazi war machine mobile. Without Standard Oil's technological assistance, Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe would have struggled to get off the ground. The panzer divisions that rolled across Europe would have sputtered and stalled. The Nazi conquest would have been impossible. And Standard Oil executives knew it. The relationship between Standard Oil and the German chemical giant IG Farben began in the 1920s, when both companies recognized the strategic value of the other's expertise. Standard Oil had unmatched knowledge in petroleum refining and fuel technology. IG Farben had pioneered synthetic chemistry, including methods for producing petroleum products from coal, which was critical for resource-poor Germany. In 1929, the two corporations entered into a comprehensive partnership, agreeing to share patents, technologies, and research. This partnership became far more than a business arrangement. It became an alliance that would fuel Hitler's military ambitions. IG Farben was not just any German company. It was the chemical and industrial colossus that would become the backbone of Nazi Germany's war economy. The company would eventually use concentration camp slave labor, operate facilities at Auschwitz, and manufacture Zyklon B, the poison gas used in extermination chambers. And throughout its darkest activities, it remained partnered with America's Standard Oil. The most critical contribution Standard Oil made to Nazi Germany was the technology to produce tetrethyl lead. If that sounds technical and insignificant, understand what it meant. Tetrethyl lead was an additive that prevented engine knock in high-performance aircraft engines. Without it, fighter planes and bombers couldn't operate effectively at high altitudes. It was the difference between having an air force and having expensive lawn ornaments. In the late 1930s, only 3 companies in the world could manufacture this specialized compound: DuPont, General Motors Ethyl Corporation, and Standard Oil. All 3 were American. In 1938, Germany faced a crisis. Hitler was preparing to seize Czechoslovakia, but the Luftwaffe had a desperate shortage of tetrethyl lead. Their own production facilities weren't scheduled to come online until 1939. Without this critical additive, Germany's air superiority would be compromised at the worst possible moment. SS Farben officials reached out to their partners at Standard Oil with an urgent request. Could Standard Oil supply 500 tons of tetrethyl lead? DuPont warned that such a massive transfer would obviously be used for military purposes. The request went through anyway. The 500 tons of tetrethyl lead was supplied through Standard Oil's British subsidiary, with the transaction facilitated by Brown Brothers, Harriman, and Company of New York. The loan was arranged on September 21, 1938, with IG Farben providing collateral. That date is significant. It was right before Hitler's planned invasion of Czechoslovakia. Standard Oil executives knew exactly what the material would be used for. They did it anyway. Without that supply, the crisis was averted for Germany. The Luftwaffe was operational. Czechoslovakia fell. But Standard Oil didn't stop at emergency supplies. The company had also transferred the complete technology for manufacturing tetrethyl lead to Germany. After the war, when IG Farben documents were captured, Nazi officials confirmed what had happened. In testimony, one IG Farben scientist stated that without the American technology transfer, Germany's wartime production of tetrethyl lead would have been impossible. The Americans had provided not just raw materials but the complete production plans, the specialized know-how, even the techniques to avoid the occupational hazards that had killed several American workers during development. It was the first time the United States had ever transferred such strategic technology to a foreign power. And they transferred it to Nazi Germany. The tetrethyl lead situation was part of a larger pattern. Standard Oil also shared technology for synthetic rubber production with IG Farben. Germany, lacking natural rubber sources, was entirely dependent on synthetic production. The Wehrmacht needed rubber for vehicle tires, tank treads, aircraft components, and countless other military applications. Standard Oil's contribution made Germany's synthetic rubber industry viable. After America entered the war, the United States faced its own rubber shortage, partially because Standard Oil had given many of the key patents for synthetic rubber production to IG Farben, and getting them back proved complicated. The president of Standard Oil during much of this period was Walter C. Teagle, who served from 1917 to 1937 and remained chairman until 1942. Teagle was deeply involved with I.G. Farben, serving as a director on the American branch of I.G. Farben and personally managing the partnership. Even as Nazi Germany's brutality became undeniable, even as Hitler's ambitions became obvious, Teagle continued the relationship. When questioned about his business dealings, he feigned ignorance about I.G. Farben's Nazi connections, a claim so implausible that investigators didn't believe him. After Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, you might assume Standard Oil would immediately cease all cooperation with Germany. That assumption would be wrong. Through neutral countries, particularly Spain, Standard Oil continued to ship petroleum products. American oil would go to Spanish ports, then be transferred to German tankers for shipment to Hamburg. Spain was officially neutral, but everyone understood that much of the oil arriving in Spanish ports was ultimately destined for Nazi Germany. In January 1944, public pressure forced a brief halt to these shipments. By May 1944, they resumed. Spain, meanwhile, was sending 48,000 tons per month of this American oil to Germany. The Truman Committee, which investigated war profiteering and corporate misconduct, eventually discovered the extent of Standard Oil's activities. Senator Harry Truman publicly stated that the actions of Standard Oil executives approached treason. The company was accused of prioritizing profits over national security, of aiding an enemy actively killing American soldiers. In 1942, under pressure from the Justice Department and facing potential criminal prosecution, Standard Oil agreed to pay a fine and provide patents to the U.S. government. The fine was $50,000. A sum so small, it was essentially meaningless to a company of Standard Oil's size. Walter Teagle resigned, but he was never prosecuted. In September 1947, a federal judge delivered a remarkable verdict regarding Standard Oil's wartime activities. Judge Charles Clark stated that Standard Oil could be considered an enemy national in view of its relationships with I.G. Farben after the United States and Germany had become active enemies. It was an extraordinary statement, an American court declaring that one of America's largest corporations had functioned as an enemy of the United States during wartime. Yet no executives went to prison. No assets were seized. The corporate structure remained intact. Standard Oil, which would later become Exxon, continued to operate and prosper. The neutral conduits, Sweden, Switzerland, and the shadow trade the activities of companies like IBM, ITT, and Standard Oil were facilitated by a network of neutral nations that served as intermediaries, allowing trade and financial transactions to continue throughout the war. Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, and Portugal all maintained official neutrality, but in practice, they served as essential economic bridges between the Axis and Allied powers. Switzerland's banks laundered Nazi gold, including gold looted from occupied countries and stolen from Holocaust victims. The Swiss National Bank alone held an estimated $440 million in Nazi gold during the war, over half of which came from looted sources. Switzerland also provided manufacturing capacity, producing precision instruments, machine parts, and weapons components that found their way to both sides. Swedish iron ore was crucial to German steel production, and Sweden's SKF ball-bearing factories supplied components essential to aircraft and tank production for both Allied and Axis forces. These neutral nations justified their trading policies by citing fear of German invasion or economic necessity, but the reality was more complex. They profited enormously from their position as middlemen. Switzerland's banks grew wealthy on deposits from fleeing refugees and Nazi officials alike. Swedish industrialists sold to the highest bidder. Spanish tungsten mines supplied both Germany and the Allies, with the material flowing to whoever paid more. The neutrals weren't passive bystanders forced into uncomfortable positions. They were active participants in a shadow economy that sustained both sides of the conflict. When World War II ended in 1945, the world began to grapple with the full scale of Nazi atrocities. 6 million Jews murdered, tens of millions of soldiers and civilians dead. Cities destroyed, entire populations displaced. The Nuremberg trials brought Nazi leaders to justice. IG Farben executives faced charges for crimes against humanity. But the American and European corporations that had enabled, profited from, and sometimes directly participated in these crimes faced minimal consequences. IBM paid nothing. The company's role in the Holocaust was not widely known until Edwin Black's research was published in 2001, more than half a century after the war ended. ITT received reparations for war damages rather than facing punishment for building weapons for Nazi Germany. Standard Oil paid a nominal fine and continued operating. The executives who had shaken hands with Hitler, who had knowingly supplied the regime with critical war materials, who had prioritized profits over human lives, retired wealthy and respected. This wasn't unique to World War II. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout the 20th century and continues into our own era. Corporations operating across borders and answering primarily to shareholders rather than governments or moral principles have consistently found ways to profit from conflict regardless of which side eventually wins. The cold calculation is simple: sell to everyone, maintain plausible deniability through subsidiary structures and neutral intermediaries, and use legal and political connections to avoid consequences afterward. What makes the World War II cases particularly disturbing is the scale of the evil these corporations supported and the irrefutable evidence of their knowledge. IBM didn't accidentally have its machines used for Holocaust administration. The company custom-designed punch card systems for racial categorization. ITT didn't stumble into ownership of Focke-Wulf. Sosthenes Bain personally negotiated with Hitler to build bombers. Standard Oil didn't inadvertently transfer tetrethyl lead technology. Walter Teagle made calculated decisions to provide Nazi Germany with fuel additives while American and British pilots faced those same German aircraft in combat. The historical record is clear. These weren't unfortunate business entanglements that predated the war. These weren't small-scale operations that executives could credibly claim to know nothing about. These were massive, ongoing relationships that required active management from corporate headquarters, that continued after war was declared, and that enriched American corporations while Nazi Germany carried out genocide and conquest. Yet the companies involved not only survived but thrived. IBM became one of the world's dominant technology corporations. ITT remained a telecommunications and manufacturing giant for decades. Standard Oil's successor companies, including Exxon and Chevron, became some of the largest and most profitable corporations in human history. None were permanently scarred by their wartime activities. None face ongoing legal liability. Most have successfully obscured their involvement, with many people today completely unaware of what these corporations did between 1933 and 1945. This raises uncomfortable questions about corporate accountability, the limits of national jurisdiction, and the relationship between capitalism and conflict. When profit becomes the sole driving force, when quarterly earnings matter more than human lives, when corporations can operate across borders while nations are at war, the traditional moral and legal frameworks break down. The Black Market Czars of World War II revealed how inadequate our systems were for holding powerful entities accountable when they chose to serve evil. Learning from the shadow economy, the story of companies that traded with both sides during World War II is not ancient history with no modern relevance. It's a blueprint that continues to be followed, though the specifics change. The fundamental pattern remains: corporations seeking profit, geopolitical conflicts creating opportunities, neutral intermediaries facilitating transactions, and post-conflict accountability that arrives slowly or not at all. Understanding this history matters because it reveals how atrocities are enabled not just by those who commit them but by those who make them administratively, technologically, and economically possible. IBM's punch card machines didn't kill anyone directly, but the Holocaust's bureaucratic efficiency would have been impossible without them. ITT's Focke-Wulf bombers killed Allied soldiers and civilians, but the American executives who financed their production never faced combat themselves. Standard Oil's tetrethyl lead didn't cause casualties, but without it, the Luftwaffe couldn't have conducted the bombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands. The Black Market Czars operated in the shadows, but their activities were known to government officials on both sides. The British and American governments were aware of what these companies were doing. They made calculated decisions not to prosecute, not to seize assets, not to treat these activities as the treason they resembled. That decision reflected a broader truth about corporate power. By 1945, these companies had become so economically significant, so integrated into the Allied war effort themselves, that dismantling them or severely punishing them was seen as impractical. This creates a vicious cycle. Corporations know that if they become large enough, important enough, and sufficiently embedded in economic infrastructure, they become effectively immune to the kinds of consequences that ordinary citizens would face for similar actions. This moral hazard encourages exactly the kind of behavior that IBM, ITT, and Standard Oil engaged in. The calculation becomes: profit from every opportunity, minimize public awareness, and rely on your economic importance to protect you from accountability. The victims of these decisions numbered in the millions. The families who were identified through IBM censuses, deported on trains scheduled by IBM systems, and murdered in camps tracked by IBM machines. The soldiers who died under fire from ITT-financed Focke-Wulf fighters. The pilots shot down by Luftwaffe planes fueled by Standard Oil technology. They left behind empty chairs at dinner tables, children who grew up without parents, communities that were erased from existence. If there's a lesson to be drawn from the Black Market Czars of World War II, it's that we cannot rely on corporations to choose morality over profit on neutral nations to stay truly neutral when money is available, or on government regulation alone to prevent these abuses. What's required is persistent public awareness, historical memory that doesn't fade, and a willingness to hold powerful entities accountable even decades after their crimes. The companies that built the Third Reich's infrastructure have never fully reckoned with what they did. There have been no meaningful apologies, no sustained efforts at restitution beyond what courts forced them to pay, no fundamental changes to corporate structures that would prevent similar decisions in future conflicts. Until that changes, the pattern will repeat. Different conflicts, different technologies, different neutral intermediaries, but the same fundamental calculation: profit from everyone, face minimal consequences, repeat. That's the true legacy of the Black Market Czars. Not just what they did between 1933 and 1945, but the example they set for every corporation that came after. The message was clear: there are fortunes to be made in conflict, ways to profit from both sides, and if you're smart and powerful enough, you'll never truly pay the price. History has taught us what happens when we let that message stand unchallenged. If you found this history eye-opening, hit that like button and subscribe to Market Memories. The past has more uncomfortable truths to reveal, and understanding them is the first step toward ensuring they don't happen again. The Black Market Czars thought they could operate in darkness. Our job is to keep shining light on what they did, no matter how many decades have passed.